A year and a half has passed since the release of the PlayStation VR, and while there are a few neat experiences to be had, I find the platform's library is still lacking. Moss looks to add to that library, but it's hard to say if it's actually any good, or if it just seems fine alongside the platform's lack of quality titles. The game is set in a fantasy world that exists in a storybook, which the player interacts with as a mystical being known as the Reader. Subtle. You must assist the hero of the story, a young mouse named Quill, also subtle, in freeing her kingdom from the evil forces that have overrun it. As far as plots go, Moss is simplistic, but it leans so hard and so earnestly into its fairy tale style that it's hard to hold this against it. With that said, there's no real twists or turns to keep players engaged, beyond the fact that it's a VR title. You literally have to be a part of this world. If this were just a normal third-person action-adventure title, I get the feeling that I'd have been over the game's initial charm pretty quickly. Still, it is a pleasant world to be a part of, with its archetypal fantasy villages and dungeons shrunk down to accommodate the game's tiny and adorable characters. These various critters are all surprisingly expressive and well animated, and the hero, Quill, even interacts with the player through tiny sign language motions on top of her adorable, more mouse-like actions. Actually, to be more specific, I was really blown away by just how fluid Quill's combat and platforming animations were. In step with the game's visuals, its soundtrack is about what you'd expect. Airy string arrangements to really hit home that fantasy vibe, punctuated by the occasional heavy score to facilitate more tense moments. The voice acting was unexpected, and the idea of it being a narrator who voices the characters too is a nice touch. More than anything, I was surprised by just how much gameplay Moss had to offer. Every time I was exposed to it prior to the game's release, I was under the impression that you only ever assisted Quill in her adventure by manipulating the environment, while the main action was all AI controlled. Thankfully that's not the case, and you get to pull double duty as both the Reader and Quill. There's nothing too complex about Moss's action-adventure gameplay. It features basic platforming and puzzles that require the player to manipulate the environment in some way, allowing Quill to proceed, with some simple combat sections mixed in to break up the monotony. I'd be lying if I said that Moss had me hooked for the duration, and a big part of that is due to the game's simplicity. You have 3 enemy types introduced across the course of the game, and only one of them requires any real different tactics to deal with. Puzzles fare a little bit better than the combat does, but everything on display is about as basic as action-adventure games get. You, as the Reader, move blocks and open doors while simultaneously controlling Quill, though there are very few situations where having to coordinate these mechanics feels like an actual challenge. During these rare occasions, the game can be quite exciting, forcing you to concentrate on multiple facets of the game at once, but for the most part, Moss seems content with keeping these mechanics separate. On their own, these mechanics are generally functional. Quill is surprisingly fun to control with basic combos, a satisfying dodge, and responsive platforming mechanics on offer. Playing as the Reader doesn't fare quite as well, however, as I found that I'd occasionally need to recalibrate my PSVR to have the game register my position and hand movements accurately. When this was functioning as intended, interacting with the world was satisfying. Shifting blocks and enemies came with a noticeable weight, and having to reposition myself and look at the stage from different angles to reveal hidden collectibles felt really cool. It's just a shame then that despite its solid mechanics, the game just doesn't do anything interesting with them until near the end. But don't worry, you'll reach the high point of the game in less than 2 hours if your experience goes anything like mine. Just as the game starts getting warmed up and gets really interesting, the credits roll, and I was left wanting so much more. I don't generally determine a game's worth based on the runtime, but it's really hard to not be disappointed by Moss, which had so much room to grow but decided to call it at 2.5 hours long. That said, Moss is mediocre. There's definitely a quality game somewhere here, there just isn't much of it. Everything feels like it stops just short of being something unique and awesome. The plot is generic fantasy fare, the gameplay is solid and exhibits some neat ideas but refuses to advance beyond the basics. And just as it's starting to get really good, it ends and has the sheer nerve to tease a sequel. If Moss turns out to be the first entry in an episodic game, with the rest of the episodes being free DLC, then I may issue a redaction to this, but as it stands right now, I can't recommend buying Moss at full price. Go play Thumper, Dino Frontier or Superhot VR instead. Moss just isn't worth it.